The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as the coffee finished brewing. By Thursday, I was standing in front of the most decrepit property I'd ever seen, wondering if desperation had finally driven me insane. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Margaret Wilson stood at the edge of the overgrown driveway, squinting through the morning mist at what the realtor had generously called a fixer-upper with potential. The main house sagged like a tired old man, its Victorian bones showing through peeling paint and broken shutters. But it wasn't the house that caught her attention. It was the massive barn looming behind it, rust-red and seemingly held together by stubborn will and wild vines. As I mentioned on the phone, the realtor, Janet, said nervously, adjusting her perfectly styled blonde hair, "The property's been on the market for 3 years. The previous owner, Ezekiel Hartley, passed without any heirs. The bank's desperate to unload it." 3 years? Margaret asked, her 72-year-old knees protesting as she navigated the rutted dirt path. Her German shepherd, Duke, trotted beside her, nose to the ground, investigating every cent with the dedication of a detective. Well, yes. Most buyers take one look and Janet trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the dilapidation surrounding them. The house needs everything: new roof, plumbing, electrical. And that barn, well, it's basically a teardown. The last interested party walked away when they saw a family of raccoons had taken up residence in the kitchen. Margaret nodded absently, her attention fixed on the barn. Something about it called to her, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the rust, turning it to burnished copper. Or perhaps it was Duke's behavior. The dog had stopped at the barn's entrance, tail wagging slowly, whining softly as if greeting an old friend. The truth was, Margaret didn't have many options. The bank had given her 90 days to vacate the home she'd shared with her late husband Robert for 45 years. Medical bills from his final battle with cancer had drained their savings, and his life insurance had barely covered the funeral. She'd worked as a librarian her entire adult life, and her pension wasn't enough to cover the mortgage payments that had ballooned after she'd refinanced to pay for experimental treatments. "The asking price is $47,000, Janet continued, "but honestly, the bank would probably accept any reasonable offer. They just want it off their books." $47,000. Margaret had exactly $52,000 from the forced sale of Robert's classic car collection, 5 vehicles he'd lovingly restored over decades, sold to dealers who'd smelled her desperation and offered insultingly low prices. It was all she had left in the world, besides Duke and a storage unit full of memories. "I'll take it," she heard herself say. Janet's perfectly penciled eyebrows shot up. I'm sorry, did you say you'll take it? Don't you want to see inside the house first, or get an inspection?" "I've seen enough." Margaret's voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Draw up the papers. Cash deal. Quick closing. Mrs. Wilson, I really must advise." "Janet," Margaret interrupted gently but firmly, "I'm 72 years old. My husband is dead, my home is being taken by the bank, and I have nowhere else to go. This place has 4 walls and a roof. That's all I need." The realtor opened and closed her mouth several times, looking like a well-dressed fish out of water. Finally, she nodded. I'll get the paperwork started. We can close by the end of the week if you're certain." As Janet hurried back to her pristine white SUV, clearly eager to escape the property's oppressive neglect, Margaret approached the barn. The massive sliding door hung crooked on its track, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Duke had already disappeared inside, his excited barking echoing in the darkness. "Duke, get back here," she called, but the dog ignored her. With a sigh, she turned sideways and slipped through the gap. The barn's interior was a study in contrasts. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through holes in the roof, illuminating a maze of covered shapes. Everything was draped in heavy canvas tarps, gray with age and dust. The air smelled of motor oil, old leather, and something else, the ghost of cigarette smoke and metal polish. Duke stood next to one of the covered shapes, tail wagging furiously, pawing at the edge of a tarp. Margaret approached cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The barn was bigger than it looked from outside, stretching back into shadows. She counted at least 30 tarp-covered forms arranged in neat rows. "What did you find, boy?" she murmured, grasping the corner of the tarp Duke had been investigating. The canvas was heavier than expected, stiff with age. She pulled, and it slid away with a whisper of protest. Margaret gasped. Beneath the tarp sat a motorcycle unlike anything she'd ever seen. Even through decades of dust, its deep blue paint gleamed like sapphire. Chrome pipes curved along its flanks like silver serpents. The badge on the fuel tank read Vincent Black Shadow in elegant script. Robert had been the motorcycle enthusiast, not her. But she'd spent enough years listening to him rhapsodize about vintage bikes to recognize something special when she saw it. The Vincent Black Shadow was the holy grail of British motorcycles, he told her once, the fastest production motorcycle in the world when it was built in the late 1940 seconds. With trembling hands, she pulled the tarp from the neck's shape. A Bruff Superior emerged, its nickel-plated frame catching the light. The one after that revealed an Indian Chief with its distinctive, skirted fenders. Then a Harley-Davidson knucklehead, its Art Deco styling intact despite the years. Margaret moved through the barn like a woman in a dream, unveiling treasure after treasure. Duke trotted beside her, occasionally barking at something that caught his attention, a mouse scurrying through the rafters or a barn owl disturbed from its roost. The motorcycles were in various states of preservation. Some appeared pristine beneath their dust coating, others showed signs of ongoing restoration. Tools hung neatly on pegboards along the walls, and a workbench in the corner held partially disassembled engines and carefully labeled boxes of parts. But it was the back wall that made her legs weak. A wooden rack held leather-bound ledgers, their spines labeled by year starting from 1946. Above them, yellowed photographs were tacked to the wall, images of a young man in military uniform standing beside various motorcycles, grinning at the camera with the confidence of youth. In later photos, the same man appeared older, grayer, but still smiling as he worked on bikes or posed with them at shows. Margaret pulled down the most recent ledger, dated 5 years ago. Ezekiel Hartley's handwriting was precise, documenting each motorcycle's history, provenance, and restoration details. The final entry, dated just a week before his death, was different. To whoever finds this collection, know that these machines were my life's work. Each one saved from scrapyards or barns, restored with love and respect for their history. I have no family to leave them to, no children to carry on the passion. Perhaps that's why I never sold the property, despite the house falling apart around me. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers pawing through my babies, breaking up the collection for profit. But time is running out. I can feel it in my bones. So I leave this note and hope that fate brings the right person to this place. Someone who will understand that these aren't just machines. They're rolling sculptures, mechanical poetry, pieces of history that deserve preservation. The documentation for each bike is complete. The titles are in the safe behind the false panel next to the workbench. The combination is the date of the Allied victory in Europe, the 8th of May 2045. Margaret sank onto a dusty crate, the ledger clutched in her lap. Duke came to rest his head on her knee, sensing her emotional turmoil. She thought of Robert, of the joy on his face when he talked about motorcycles, of the dreams they'd shared about opening a vintage vehicle museum someday, dreams that had died with him in that sterile hospital room. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, "you would have loved this." The next few hours passed in a blur. Margaret found the safe exactly where Ezekiel had indicated, hidden behind a cunningly crafted panel that looked like part of the wall. Inside were manila folders for each motorcycle, containing titles, documentation, and professional appraisals done at various times over the years. The numbers made her dizzy. The Vincent Black Shadow alone was valued at $300,000 in an appraisal from 3 years ago. The Bruff Superior, the same model Lawrence of Arabia had famously died riding, carried a $400,000 estimate. The Indian Chief, in its original unrestored condition, was labeled museum quality with a value of $200,000. She counted 43 motorcycles in total, ranging from the spectacular to the merely rare. The collection's total value, according to the most recent estimates, exceeded $8 million. And that was before considering that motorcycle values had been climbing steeply in recent years as collectors competed for the dwindling supply of vintage machines. Margaret sat in that dusty barn, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of mechanical history, and laughed. She laughed until her sides hurt, until Duke began barking in concern, until the laughter turned to sobs that shook her entire frame. 3 days ago, she'd been facing homelessness. Now she owned a collection that would make the Guggenheim jealous. The irony was almost too much to bear. When she finally composed herself, the sun had climbed high in the sky. Janet would be wondering where she'd gone, but Margaret couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. She walked slowly through the collection again, this time really looking at each bike, trying to see them as Ezekiel had, not as dollar signs, but as preserved pieces of history. Near the back of the barn, she found his workshop area more thoroughly. A notebook lay open on the bench, covered in dust but still readable. It was a restoration journal for a 1938 Crocker, apparently Ezekiel's last project. The bike itself sat nearby, partially disassembled, but even in pieces, clearly something special. Only about 100 Crockers ever made. Robert's voice echoed in her memory. They're the rarest of the rare. Jerry Seinfeld has one, paid over $700,000 for it. Margaret ran her fingers over the notebook, reading Ezekiel's meticulous notes about sourcing original parts, consulting with other Crocker owners, researching period-correct paint codes. The man had been a scholar of his craft, approaching each restoration with the dedication of an archaeologist reconstructing ancient artifacts. Duke's sudden barking drew her attention to the barn door. Janet stood in the gap, peering into the darkness with obvious reluctance to enter. "Mrs. Wilson, are you in there? I've been calling." "I'm here," Margaret called back, making her way through the maze of motorcycles. "Sorry, I lost track of time." She emerged into the sunlight, blinking like a mole. Janet's expression shifted from concern to confusion as she took in Margaret's dust-covered appearance and tear-stained cheeks. "Is everything all right? Did you find something disturbing?" "I knew we should have done an inspection first. If there's structural damage or—" "Everything's fine," Margaret interrupted. "Better than fine, actually. When can we close?" "Well, I've spoken to the bank. They're eager to move forward. We could close as early as Friday if you're certain. But Mrs. Wilson, I really think you should reconsider. This property is going to need enormous investment just to be livable." Margaret thought of the 43 motorcycles waiting in the barn, each one worth more than the asking price of the entire property. "I'll manage," she said simply. "Friday works perfectly." The closing went smoothly, though Janet continued to express concerns right up until Margaret signed the final papers. As the new owner of 12 acres of neglected paradise, Margaret's first order of business was securing the barn. She drove to the nearest town, Millbrook, according to the faded sign, and purchased new padlocks, chains, and basic security equipment. At the local hardware store, she met Gary Henderson, a contractor in his 50s with calloused hands and honest eyes. When she mentioned buying the Hartley place, his eyebrows rose. "That's a big project for anyone," he said carefully. "The house has been empty for years. You planning to restore it?" "Eventually," Margaret replied. "But first I need to secure the barn. There are items inside I need to protect." Gary nodded slowly. "Ezekiel was particular about that barn. Never let anyone inside that I know of. You find anything interesting?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "Some old equipment. I'll need to sort through it all eventually." "Well, if you need help with the house, I'm available. Fair prices, honest work. Here's my card." That evening, Margaret sat in her car in the driveway of her new property, Duke curled up in the back seat. The house loomed dark and unwelcoming, but the barn, now secured with new locks, held promise beyond her wildest dreams. She'd found a pet-friendly motel in Millbrook for temporary lodging while she figured out her next steps. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of paperwork and preparation. Margaret signed documents, transferred funds, and officially became the owner of 12 acres of neglected property, one dilapidated Victorian house, and one rusty barn hiding the motorcycle collection of a lifetime. She spent her days researching. The Millbrook Library had decent internet, and Margaret immersed herself in the vintage motorcycle market, Online forums buzzed with speculation about barn finds, neglected treasures discovered in forgotten storage. The stories were legendary: a dusty warehouse in Portugal yielding hundreds of unrestored motorcycles, a barn in Oklahoma containing a collector's lifetime accumulation sold for millions at auction. But Ezekiel's collection was different. These weren't just accumulated machines, they were curated pieces of history. His notebooks revealed not just mechanical knowledge, but deep understanding of each bike's significance. The 1915 Harley-Davidson Model 11F had been used by the military in the Mexican Border War. The 1929 Bro Superior SS100 was one of only 3,048 ever made. The Henderson Excelsior had set land speed records in the 1,920 seconds. Each motorcycle had a story, meticulously documented. Ezekiel had interviewed previous owners when possible, traced racing histories, even tracked down period photographs of the specific machines. It wasn't just a collection, it was an archive. During one of her library sessions, Margaret discovered an old newspaper article about Ezekiel Hartley. The faded newsprint showed him at a motorcycle rally in 1972, standing beside Annie in a gleaming Norton Commando. The caption read, "Local couple takes first place in restoration competition." The article went on to describe how Ezekiel and Annie had met at a motorcycle dealership where she worked as a bookkeeper and he came to buy parts. Their first date had been a ride through the mountains on his BSA Gold Star. They married a year later, with Annie arriving at the ceremony on that same motorcycle, her wedding dress specially tailored to allow riding. "They were inseparable," the article quoted a friend. "Where you saw one, you saw the other, usually with a motorcycle nearby." They had plans to open a museum someday, to share their passion with others. Margaret carefully photocopied the article, adding it to her growing file about Ezekiel's life. Each piece of information helped her understand the man who'd assembled this extraordinary collection and why he'd hidden it away after Annie's death. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, noticed Margaret's research and approached with another folder. "I remembered the Hartleys," she said quietly. "I pulled these from our local history archives. Thought they might interest you." The folder contained more newspaper clippings, photographs from town events, and even a handwritten letter Annie had sent to the library board in 1976, offering to teach motorcycle maintenance classes for women. She was ahead of her time, Mrs. Foster explained. The board turned her down, said it wasn't appropriate, but Annie kept pushing boundaries. She was the first woman in the county to get a motorcycle racing license. One photograph particularly struck Margaret: Annie standing beside a group of young women, all in riding gear, all grinning at the camera. The caption identified them as the Millbrook Valkyries, the women's riding club Annie had founded. "My mother was one of them," Mrs. Foster added, pointing to a young woman on Annie's left. She said Annie changed her life, showed her that women could claim their own freedom on two wheels. Margaret's research was interrupted on the fourth day by a knock at her motel room door. Duke barked once, then wagged his tail, his signal for friend, not threat. She opened the door to find Gary Henderson standing with a younger man who shared his square jaw and honest demeanor. "Mrs. Wilson, this is my son Jake. He's an electrician. We were driving by your property and noticed the house's electrical meter had been tampered with. Thought you should know." Margaret's blood ran cold. Tampered with how? "Someone tried to restore power illegally," Jake explained. "Probably kids looking for a party spot, or maybe copper thieves checking if the place was truly abandoned. We secured it, but you might want to consider some additional security measures." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If thieves discovered what was in the barn. "Thank you for letting me know," she managed. "I appreciate you looking out for the property." Gary studied her with perceptive eyes. "Ma'am, I don't mean to pry, but if there's something valuable in that barn, word tends to travel in small towns. Might be worth considering some professional security sooner rather than later." After they left, Margaret sat on the motel bed. Duke pressed against her leg as if sensing her distress. She'd been naive, thinking simple padlocks would protect millions of dollars worth of motorcycles. The collection needed proper security, climate control to prevent deterioration, insurance. The list seemed endless, and her resources were limited. She spent the evening creating spreadsheets, calculating costs, trying to find a path forward that didn't involve selling the entire collection, but every scenario required more capital than her remaining $5,000 could provide. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret returned to the property. The moon was full, casting silver light across the neglected grounds. Duke stayed close as she unlocked the barn and slipped inside. In the moonlight, the motorcycles looked like sleeping beasts, waiting to roar back to life. She moved among them slowly, reading the notes Ezekiel had attached to various bikes. On a 1948 Indian Chief, bought from Mary Patterson, widow of Sergeant James Patterson, KIA Korea 1951. She wept handing over the keys, said it still smelled like him, promised to preserve it in his honor. On a rare Ariel Square 4, found in a collapsed garage in Nebraska, owner's grandson wanted to scrap it, paid him double scrap value, and drove 1,400 miles to save it. Annie said I was crazy. Maybe I was, but look at it now. On the BSA Gold Star, Annie had ridden to their wedding. Not for sale, not for display. This one stays covered until someone who understands its significance takes over this collection. That note decided it for Margaret. She couldn't sell to collectors who would see only investment opportunities. These motorcycles were memorials, tributes, pieces of souls preserved in steel and chrome. They deserve better than to be parceled out to the highest bidders. The next morning, she called Tom Brennan at his motorcycle shop. She'd chosen him carefully after research showed he was respected in the vintage motorcycle community, honest, knowledgeable, and discreet. When Tom arrived and saw the collection, his reaction was everything Margaret had hoped for and feared. The burly man actually tears up at the sight of the Vincent Black Shadow, running his hands over it with the reverence of a pilgrim touching a holy relic. "This is museum quality," he breathed. "Every collector in the world would kill for this opportunity. Mrs. Wilson, what exactly are your plans?" Margaret explained her situation honestly. The unexpected inheritance, the need for security and restoration funds, her desire to honor Ezekiel's legacy while being practical about her own survival. Tom listened thoughtfully, examining motorcycles as she spoke. His knowledge impressed her. He identified rare variations, prototype parts, and historical significance that even Ezekiel's notes hadn't captured. "This Indian," he said, stopping beside a 1940 model, "see the serial number? This is one of the last built before the factory converted to military production. There are maybe 3 others known to exist." He paused at the Crocker, studying Ezekiel's restoration notes. He was doing museum-quality work here. Look at these invoices. He was sourcing parts from the Crocker family themselves, getting authentication for every component. This isn't just restoration, it's preservation at the highest level. Tom's reverence for the collection convinced Margaret she'd found the right advisor. Over several hours, they discussed options, from selling individual bikes to finding institutional buyers who would preserve the collection intact. "I know collectors who would pay top dollar for individual bikes, but breaking up this collection would be a crime. What if instead we found a single buyer for the whole lot? Someone who would preserve it as Ezekiel intended? The whole collection?" Margaret's mind reeled. Who could afford that? There's a tech billionaire in Seattle, Marcus Chin. He's been building a transportation museum, cars, planes, motorcycles. He has the resources and the vision to do this right. I could reach out, see if he's interested. Margaret hesitated. Selling the entire collection would solve all her financial problems, but it felt like abandoning a responsibility. "Let me think about it." That afternoon, she returned to the barn alone except for Duke. She moved through the collection slowly, reading Ezekiel's notes, studying his photographs. In one image, a younger Ezekiel stood with a woman beside a BSA Gold Star. The woman's smile was radiant, her hand resting possessively on the motorcycle's tank. On the back in faded ink, Annie's first ride on the Gold Star, 1967. She said it was like flying without wings. Margaret found the Gold Star under its tarp, a note attached to the handlebars. Annie's favorite. She rode this to our wedding, white dress and all. Never to be sold. There were other such notes throughout the collection. Jim Morrison's Triumph. He traded me for it in '69, said it had too many memories. Bought from a widow in Topeka who cried handing over the keys, her son's bike, KIA Vietnam. Racing bike from Sturgis, still has the champagne stains from the victory celebration. These weren't just machines, they were repositories of human stories, preserved in steel and chrome. Ezekiel hadn't just collected motorcycles, he'd collected memories, dreams, pieces of people's lives, and he'd trusted them to whoever fate brought to his barn. She spent hours that day going through Ezekiel's workshop more thoroughly. In a filing cabinet, she found correspondence dating back decades, letters from other collectors, technical discussions about restoration techniques, and most touchingly, love letters between Ezekiel and Annie during a brief period when work had separated them. "My darling Ez," one letter began, "the Norton's running perfectly after your adjustments. I took it up to the mountain road yesterday, the one where we first kissed, and I swear I could feel you riding beside me. Only 3 more weeks until you're home, and we can ride together again. The garage feels empty without your terrible singing while you work." In another drawer, she found Annie's writing journals, documenting thousands of miles traveled across America. Her writing was vivid, bringing to life the experience of crossing the country on 2 wheels in the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds. The 15th of June, 1974, somewhere in Kansas. "The Harley's running rough, but Ez will sort it when we stop. Today we met an old farmer who'd never seen a woman on a motorcycle. He asked if I was one of those women's libbers. I told him I was just a woman who liked to ride. He thought about that for a long moment, then said, 'I reckon that's liberation enough.' Ez laughed so hard he nearly fell off his bike." Margaret carefully returned the letters to their folder, feeling like an intruder into a private world of love and loss. But they helped her understand why Ezekiel had retreated into solitude after Annie's death. How do you continue sharing your passion when the person who understood it best is gone? That evening, Margaret called Tom. "I can't sell the collection. Not to a billionaire, not to anyone. These bikes need to stay together, and they need to stay accessible. I'm going to create the museum Ezekiel envisioned." Tom's silence spoke volumes before he finally responded. "That's admirable, Mrs. Wilson. But do you have any idea what that involves? Insurance alone could run tens of thousands annually. Then I'll figure it out one step at a time. Can you help me identify which bikes might be duplicates or less historically significant? I'll sell just enough to get started." What happens next will transform a widow's desperate purchase into something extraordinary, reveal why Ezekiel chose to hide his collection from the world, and remind us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Tom agreed to help, and over the next week, they carefully evaluated the collection. During this process, Tom shared stories about Ezekiel that he'd heard over the years. How the man had once driven 3 states away to rescue a Vincent from being melted down for scrap. How he'd spent 2 years tracking down original parts for a Bro Superior restoration. How he'd turned down offers that would have made him wealthy because he couldn't bear to see the collection broken up. He was a purist, Tom explained, examining a 1936 Harley-Davidson knucklehead. But not in a snobby way. He just believed these machines deserved to be preserved as they were designed, not modified to suit modern tastes. Tom also revealed something that didn't appear in any newspaper clippings. Ezekiel kept riding for about a year after Annie died, but it wasn't the same. I saw him once at a gas station, sitting on his bike, just staring at the empty space where she should have been. He sold that bike the next week and never rode again. They identified 5 motorcycles that could be sold without compromising the collection's historical completeness. Each decision was agonizing. Every bike had been saved by Ezekiel for a reason, but Margaret chose ones that were well represented in other museums or collections. During this process, Jake Henderson often stopped by after work, drawn by the mechanical marvels. His enthusiasm reminded Margaret of Robert in younger days, and she found herself teaching him what she'd learned from Ezekiel's notes. "Look at this engine design," Jake said one evening, studying a 1,920 seconds Indian Scout. They were solving problems we still face today, just with different materials and tools. It's like archaeology, but for engineering. His genuine interest sparked an idea. If she could inspire young people like Jake to care about preservation, the museum would serve Ezekiel's vision of passing knowledge to future generations. Margaret decided to sell 5 motorcycles. Good examples, but not unique to the collection. The process was harder than she'd anticipated. Each bike had its own story, its own reason for being saved. But she chose ones that were well represented in other collections, keeping Ezekiel's most unique specimens. The 1,947 Harley-Davidson Knucklehead went to auction for $89,000, bought by a collector who promised to preserve its originality. A restored Indian Scout brought $67,000, going to a museum in Milwaukee. 3 British bikes, nice examples, but not exceptional, netted another $95,000 combined. With $251,000 in hand, Margaret began the transformation. Gary Henderson and his crew started on the house, making it livable while preserving its historic character. The electrical system was completely updated, plumbing replaced, and a new roof installed. The Victorians' bones were indeed solid, and slowly, the house began to reveal its former dignity. During construction, workers discovered a hidden room in the attic, Ezekiel's private study, untouched since his death. The small space was lined with books about motorcycle history, technical manuals, and photo albums. A desk held unfinished correspondence, including a half-written letter to a museum in Milwaukee inquiring about preservation techniques. But it was the wall of photographs that stopped Margaret cold. Hundreds of images chronicled Ezekiel and Annie's life together: motorcycle rallies, cross-country trips, quiet moments in the garage. In every photo, their joy was palpable. They'd built a life around their shared passion, and losing Annie had shattered that world completely. One album was dedicated entirely to their planned museum. Sketches showed display layouts, educational programs, even a workshop where visitors could learn basic maintenance. Notes in the margins revealed their vision: not just static displays, but living history. People should understand how these machines work, why they mattered, what they meant to the people who rode them. Margaret spent an entire day in that small room, absorbing the dreams that had died with Annie. By evening, she'd made a decision. She wouldn't just preserve Ezekiel's collection, she'd realize the vision he and Annie had shared. She found more treasures in that room: Annie's designed notebooks for the museum, filled with ideas for making mechanical history accessible to all ages. A box of correspondence with other female riders from across the country. Plans for a riding school specifically for women, breaking down barriers in a male-dominated culture. One letter particularly moved Margaret from a young woman in Texas. "Mrs. Hartley, your article in Cycle World changed my life. I showed it to my father, who'd always said motorcycles weren't for girls. He read about you racing, about your mechanical knowledge, about your refusal to be limited by others' expectations. Last week, he took me to buy my first bike. Thank you for showing us both what's possible." The barn renovation began next. Climate control was essential. Temperature and humidity fluctuations were slowly degrading the motorcycles. A specialized HVAC system cost $30,000 but would preserve the collection for generations. Security came next: cameras, motion sensors, and a direct line to the sheriff's office. During the renovation, Margaret discovered more about Ezekiel's preservation methods. He created detailed climate logs, tracking temperature and humidity changes throughout the seasons. His notes revealed an almost obsessive attention to detail: which bikes needed more ventilation, which were susceptible to condensation, how to position fans for optimal air circulation without disturbing dust that served as a protective patina. Jake Henderson, Gary's electrician's son, became a regular presence. He shared Margaret's appreciation for the mechanical artistry and often stayed after work to help her catalog the collection. His enthusiasm reminded her of Robert in his younger days, when he could spend hours discussing the elegance of a well-designed engine. "These aren't just old motorcycles," Jake said one evening, carefully polishing a 1,920 board track racer. "They're proof that people have always pushed boundaries, always sought to go faster, farther, to turn imagination into reality." Margaret smiled at his enthusiasm. "You sound like my husband. He believed every machine had a soul, put there by the hands that built it." "He was right," Jake replied. "Look at this engine. Someone designed every curve, machined every surface, assembled it with their own hands. How is that not putting soul into metal? Jake's understanding went deeper than mere appreciation. He began researching the specific histories of bikes in the collection, uncovering stories even Ezekiel hadn't documented. The board track racer, he discovered, had been ridden by Jim Davis, who died in a racing accident in 1923 at age 22. His mother kept the bike for 50 years. Jake told Margaret, showing her a newspaper article he'd found. She said it was all she had left of him. When she died, her children were going to scrap it, but Ezekiel heard about it and saved it. These stories reinforce Margaret's determination to create more than just a static display. Each motorcycle represented human dreams, risks, loves, and losses. They deserved to have their stories told. As word of the collection inevitably spread through Millbrook, Margaret faced a delicate balance. She needed community support but couldn't risk attracting the wrong attention. She began hosting small, private viewings for trusted locals, building goodwill and establishing the collection's cultural value to the town. Dorothy May, who ran the local diner, became an unexpected ally. The 70-year-old had ridden motorcycles in her youth, scandalizing her conservative family by joining a women's riding club in the 1,960 seconds. "I had a Honda CB 350, she told Margaret over coffee and homemade pie. "Nothing fancy like your collection, but it meant freedom. My parents said nice girls didn't ride motorcycles. I said nice girls did whatever they damn well pleased." Dorothy May shared stories of the women's motorcycle club she'd belonged to, the Millbrook Valkyries. They'd been a mix of rebels and respectable ladies, united by their love of riding. The club had disbanded in the 1,980 seconds as members married, moved away, or simply aged out of riding. "We used to meet right here in the diner," Dorothy May recalled. "Plan rides, share maintenance tips, support each other through whatever life threw at us. There's something about women who ride. We understand that freedom isn't given, it's taken." She disappeared into the diner's back room, returning with a dusty photo album. Inside were images of the Millbrook Valkyries in their heyday, women of all ages on various motorcycles, faces glowing with joy and defiance. "That's Annie Hartley." Dorothy May pointed to a woman on a BSA. "She founded the club, said women had as much right to the road as anyone. She taught us to maintain our own bikes, to not depend on men for repairs or permission." Margaret studied the photos, seeing Annie not just as Ezekiel's lost love, but as a pioneer who'd opened doors for other women. It added another dimension to the museum's mission, not just preserving machines, but celebrating the people who'd refused to be limited by society's expectations. Her endorsement carried weight in Millbrook. If Dorothy May vouched for Margaret and the museum project, others followed suit. The diner became an informal headquarters where supporters gathered to plan fundraisers and events. One significant early supporter was Judge Patricia Hawkins, who'd retired to Millbrook after decades on the bench in Chicago. She arrived at one of Margaret's private viewings, wearing designer clothes and skepticism, but her demeanor changed the moment she saw a 1,958 Harley-Davidson Duo Glide. "My father had one exactly like this," she said softly, running her fingers over the turquoise and white paint. "He'd take me for rides when I was little, before my mother found out and put a stop to it. I can still remember holding on to him, feeling like I was flying." She shared a memory that had shaped her career. "When I was 8, I asked my father why Mommy didn't like the motorcycle. He said, 'Some people are afraid of others' freedom.' I didn't understand then, but I thought about it often when I became a judge. How fear makes people try to control others, limit their choices." Judge Hawkins became a fierce advocate for the museum, using her legal expertise to help Margaret navigate zoning issues and establish nonprofit status. She also shared a crucial piece of local history. Millbrook had once been a stop on the motorcycle racing circuit in the 1,950 seconds, drawing thousands of spectators to hill climb competitions. "The town's got motorcycles in its blood," she explained. "People have just forgotten. Your museum could help them remember." She produced old photographs from the town archives showing Millbrook's Main Street packed with motorcycles, riders, and spectators. Local businesses had thrived during race weekends. Young people had found heroes in the riders who defied gravity climbing impossible slopes. My uncle ran a motorcycle shop here in the 50s, Judge Hawkins added. He said those races brought the whole region together. When they ended, something vital went out of the town. As Margaret's plan solidified, resistance emerged from unexpected quarters. The first town council meeting where she presented the museum concept revealed deep divisions in the community. "We don't need more noise and trouble," complained Harold Morrison, whose family had run the local bank for generations. "Motorcycle people are troublemakers, always have been." But Dorothy May stood to counter him. "Harold Morrison, your own father rode a Harley to work every day until you convinced him it wasn't dignified for a banker. Don't rewrite history to suit your prejudices." The meeting grew heated, with supporters and detractors voicing strong opinions. Margaret listened, understanding that she needed to address fears as well as build enthusiasm. "This isn't about creating a biker bar or a racing venue," she explained calmly. "It's about preserving history, creating educational opportunities, and celebrating the innovation that motorcycles represent. The museum will be a quiet, respectful place where families can learn together." Judge Hawkins added legal weight. "I've reviewed Mrs. Wilson's plans thoroughly. The museum will operate under strict guidelines, with limited hours and controlled access. This isn't Sturgis, it's cultural preservation." The debate continued for hours, but eventually, the council voted to support the museum project, with conditions about noise levels, hours of operation, and special event restrictions. It was a victory, but Margaret knew she'd need to continually prove the museum's value to skeptics. One critical moment came when Harrison Webb arrived. The slick dealer from Dallas had somehow heard about the collection and showed up with a briefcase full of cash and a silver tongue. "Mrs. Wilson, I represent serious collectors who appreciate the cultural significance of these machines," he said, standing in the barn as if he already owned it. "I'm prepared to offer $4 million for the complete collection. Cash transaction, no questions asked." Duke growled softly from his position beside Margaret. She placed a calming hand on his head. "Mr. Webb, these motorcycles represent more than monetary value. They're historical artifacts that belong together. History doesn't pay bills, ma'am. $4 million could make you very comfortable for whatever years you have left." The condescension in his tone, "whatever years you have left," sparked something in Margaret. "Mr. Webb, I'm 72, not dead, and these motorcycles will be preserved for generations long after both of us are gone. Good day." Harrison didn't give up easily. Over the following weeks, he increased his offers, left messages, even tried to charm locals into pressuring Margaret. But Millbrook had adopted her and the museum project as their own. Harrison found no allies in his campaign. He tried different tactics, spreading rumors that Margaret was senile, that the motorcycles were stolen, that the barn was a fire hazard endangering the whole town. Each attack was met with fierce local resistance. Tom Brennan confronted Harrison at the diner one morning. "You're not from here, so let me explain something. Mrs. Wilson has shown more respect for this town's history in 6 months than you could in 6 lifetimes. Take your money and your lies and get out." Harrison made one final attempt, arriving with 2 other men who claimed to be motorcycle preservation experts. They insisted on inspecting the collection for authentication purposes. Margaret recognized the ploy immediately. "Mr. Webb, unless you have a warrant, you're trespassing. I've asked you to leave multiple times. Sheriff Johnson is on speed dial." The threat of legal action finally drove Harrison away, but the experience taught Margaret valuable lessons about protecting the collection from those who saw only dollar signs. His most aggressive move came when he hired a lawyer to research the property's title, looking for any weakness he could exploit. The lawyer, a sharp young woman named Melissa Grant, spent days at the county courthouse examining records. But instead of finding leverage for Harrison, Melissa discovered something that changed her perspective entirely. Hidden in the property records was evidence that Ezekiel had quietly paid off mortgages for 3 Millbrook families during the 2008 financial crisis, allowing them to keep their homes. He'd done it anonymously, the only record being notations in legal documents. She found more. Ezekiel had donated to the local school when budget cuts threatened the shop class. He'd paid for young people to attend technical schools. He'd quietly supported families when breadwinners were injured or ill. Melissa confronted Harrison with this information. The man you're trying to posthumously rob saved this community. I won't be part of destroying his legacy. She not only dropped Harrison as a client, but offered her services pro bono to help Margaret establish the museum's legal structure. I became a lawyer to help people, Melissa told Margaret. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. You've reminded me why I chose this profession. Her expertise proved invaluable in establishing the museum's nonprofit status, creating bylaws that would protect the collection in perpetuity, and ensuring that the museum's educational mission couldn't be corrupted by future boards focused on profit. The turning point came when Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Dr. James Patterson, a retired Harley-Davidson engineer, had heard about the collection through motorcycle circles. When he entered the barn, his reaction was immediate and emotional. "My God," he breathed, approaching a 1,965 Electra Glide. "I designed the suspension modification on this model. We fought for weeks about the rear shock placement." He turned to Margaret with tears in his eyes. "I spent 40 years designing motorcycles, but I've rarely seen them preserved with such care. Most end up customized beyond recognition or rusting in backyards." Dr. Patterson spent the entire day in the barn, sharing stories about design challenges, corporate politics, and the constant balance between innovation and tradition. He identified several rare prototype parts in Ezekiel's collection that even Margaret hadn't recognized as significant. "This exhaust system," he said, pointing to a Sportster, "was my design. Management killed it because it was too expensive to mass produce. I only know of 3 that made it out of the factory. Ezekiel has one of them." He shared stories that brought the motorcycles to life. "This Electra Glide was the first to use our new suspension. The test rider said it was like floating on a cloud of controlled power. Marketing loved that phrase so much they wanted to use it, but legal said it promised too much." Before leaving, he made an offer that transformed the museum's prospects. "I have archives, blueprints, design notes, test reports, correspondence with racers and dealers, boxes of material I saved when Harley cleaned out old files. Would they be useful for your museum?" "Useful?" Margaret could barely contain her excitement. "Dr. Patterson, those documents would make this collection truly exceptional. We could show not just the finished machines, but the human process of creation. Then they're yours. On one condition, that you let me volunteer as a docent when the museum opens. I'm 78 years old, and I want to spend whatever time I have left sharing what I know with people who care." Dr. Patterson's involvement elevated the museum project from local curiosity to serious historical preservation. He used his industry connections to spread word about Margaret's efforts, drawing interest from motorcycle historians worldwide. One of those connections led to a discovery that even Tom Brennan hadn't anticipated. A British motorcycle historian named Nigel Worthington contacted Margaret about a Vincent in the collection. Through careful research, he determined it was one of the Chinese Vincents, bikes sold to the Chinese military in the 1952 and thought lost during the Cultural Revolution. "There are perhaps 5 known to exist worldwide," Nigel explained via video call. "Ezekiel's example is the most complete I've seen. It's not just valuable, it's historically irreplaceable." He shared the bike's probable history. Based on the serial number and certain modifications, this Vincent likely served in the motorcycle corps of the People's Liberation Army. How it made its way to America is a mystery, but Ezekiel's notes mention buying it from an estate sale in San Francisco's Chinatown. The discovery added international significance to the collection. Museums from Beijing to London expressed interest in loans or collaborations. But Margaret remained focused on her local mission, creating a place where Millbrook's residents could discover their own connections to motorcycle history. As summer turned to fall, the museum project gained momentum. Margaret's daughter, Emma, a marketing executive in Seattle, took leave from her job to help develop the business plan. She arrived expecting to find her mother overwhelmed by an impossible project. Instead, she discovered a vibrant woman with purpose and a community rallying around a shared dream. "Mom, you look 10 years younger," Emma said, watching Margaret confidently direct placement of display platforms in the barn. I feel it too, Margaret admitted. After your father died, I thought my useful life was over. But these motorcycles, this place, the people, they've given me a reason to wake up excited each morning. Emma's professional skills proved invaluable. She created comprehensive budgets, developed marketing strategies, and began building the museum's digital presence. Her business plan impressed even skeptics, showing how the museum could be financially sustainable through a combination of admissions, educational programs, and special events. She also brought a fresh perspective to the collection's stories. Mom, these aren't just motorcycle stories, they're American stories. Immigration, innovation, women's rights, veteran experiences, economic history. We can connect with people who think they have no interest in motorcycles. Emma interviewed community members, documenting their connections to motorcycles. The stories poured out. The doctor who'd paid for medical school by racing on weekends. The teacher who'd met her husband at a motorcycle rally. The farmer who'd used an old Harley to check fence lines for 40 years. Everyone has a motorcycle story, Emma realized. They just need someone to ask. But it was her idea for a founder's circle that provided crucial early funding. For a significant donation, supporters would have their names permanently displayed in the museum and receive lifetime membership benefits. The response exceeded all expectations. Judge Hawkins contributed $25,000. Dorothy May organized a fundraiser that brought in $15,000, and other community members gave what they could. One particularly moving contribution came from Walter Chin, who ran the local Chinese restaurant. He arrived at Margaret's door with an envelope containing $5,000 in cash, his entire savings. "Mr. Ezekiel helped my family when we first came to America," he explained when Margaret protested the size of the gift. "No one would rent to Chinese immigrants in 1985. He gave us a chance and helped us fix our first restaurant space. This museum honors him, so I honor it." Walter shared more of the story. "My English was very bad. I couldn't understand the lease agreement. Mr. Ezekiel spent hours explaining everything, even drew pictures to help me understand. He said America was built by people taking chances on each other." Stories like Walter's emerged throughout the community. Ezekiel had quietly helped dozens of people over the years, offering employment to those who needed it, providing references for loans, even posting bail for young people who'd made mistakes. The bitter hermit of his final years had once been a pillar of the community. Melissa Grant, the lawyer who'd abandoned Harrison Webb, became instrumental in documenting these stories. "We're not just preserving motorcycles," she said. "We're preserving the legacy of a man who understood that communities are built on quiet kindness." Emma threw herself into the project with inherited determination. She created a website, established social media presence, and began reaching out to motorcycle clubs and museums worldwide. The response was overwhelming. Enthusiasts offering to volunteer, museums proposing partnerships, and magazines requesting feature stories. "Mom, we need to think about staffing," Emma said one evening. "Even with volunteers, we'll need at least a part-time curator and someone to handle educational programs." Margaret had been thinking the same thing. Jake Henderson has shown real aptitude for the mechanical side. And there's a retired teacher, Sarah Morrison, who's expressed interest in developing programs for schools. Sarah Morrison proved to be another gift to the project. The 65-year-old had taught high school history for 30 years and understood how to make the past relevant to young people. "Motorcycles are perfect for teaching history," she explained. "They touch on industrialization, women's suffrage, both world wars, the counterculture movement, economic cycles. I can build an entire curriculum around this." Collection. She developed programs that aligned with state educational standards while remaining engaging. Students would learn about WWI while examining military motorcycles. They'd explore women's rights through the stories of early female riders. They'd understand economic principles by studying the rise and fall of American motorcycle manufacturers. "Learning should be tactile," Sarah insisted. "Let them touch the machines, hear the engines, understand the mechanics." That's how history comes alive. As they discussed logistics, Duke suddenly alert, ears perked toward the window. Moments later, headlights appeared in the driveway, unusual for the late hour. Margaret recognized Tom Brennan's truck, but his urgent expression when she opened the door sent alarm through her. "We've got a problem," Tom said. "Harrison Webb hasn't given up. He's been spreading rumors that you're not mentally competent to manage the collection, that you're being manipulated by locals trying to profit from an elderly woman's confusion." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "What kind of rumors?" "He's telling collectors that you're showing signs of dementia, that your daughter is planning to have you declared incompetent and sell the collection once she gets control." Tom's jaw clenched. "He's even hired a private investigator to dig into your background, looking for anything he can use." Emma's face flushed with anger. "That's slander. We should sue." "It's more serious than that," Tom interrupted. "He's convinced 2 major collectors to submit formal concerns to Adult Protective Services. They're obligated to investigate any reports of elder exploitation." The room fell silent, except for Duke's low growl. Margaret sank into a chair, the weight of this new threat pressing down on her. At 72, after everything she'd overcome, was she going to lose it all to malicious rumors? "No," she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I've come too far to be stopped by a bitter man's lies. What do we need to do?" Tom outlined a strategy. They would need character witnesses, financial records showing responsible management, and, most importantly, documentation of Margaret's mental competence. Judge Hawkins could help navigate the legal aspects, while Dr. Patterson's endorsement would carry weight in the motorcycle community. Over the next weeks, the community rallied around Margaret in ways that brought tears to her eyes. Dozens of people wrote letters attesting to her mental sharpness and responsible management of the project. The bank manager detailed her careful financial planning. Gary Henderson described her thoughtful approach to the renovation. Dr. Sarah Peterson, Margaret's physician, provided a particularly powerful statement. "I've been treating Mrs. Wilson for 5 years. She's one of my sharpest patients of any age. Her blood pressure has actually improved since she began this project. Purpose and community engagement are the best medicines I know, most powerfully." Melissa Grant, the lawyer who'd abandoned Harrison Webb, submitted a formal statement exposing his attempts to manipulate the situation for profit. She included evidence of similar schemes he'd attempted with other elderly collectors, painting a picture of a predator who specialized in exploiting older people with valuable collections. "Mr. Webb approached me believing I'd help him find legal loopholes to force a sale," Melissa wrote. "When I investigated the situation, I found a competent senior citizen creating a community asset with remarkable fiscal responsibility and vision. I also found Mr. Webb's pattern of elder exploitation across multiple states." The Adult Protective Services investigation was thorough but fair. The social worker assigned to the case, Jennifer Paulson, spent hours with Margaret, reviewing records and observing her management of the museum project. She also interviewed community members and examined the financial structure Emma had helped establish. Jennifer later told Margaret privately, "I've investigated hundreds of cases. This is the first time I've found an elderly person allegedly being exploited who's actually creating jobs and educational opportunities for their community." During one interview, Jennifer asked Margaret to walk her through the museum's business plan. Margaret not only explained the current structure but outlined 5-year projections, educational partnerships, and succession planning that would protect the institution beyond her lifetime. "Mrs. Wilson," Jennifer said at their final meeting, "not only have I found no evidence of exploitation or incompetence, but I'm genuinely impressed by what you've accomplished here. You've turned a potential windfall into a community asset with proper oversight and sustainable planning. I'll be recommending that the case be closed with no action required." She paused, then added, "Off the record, I'll also be recommending that Mr. Webb be flagged for potential elder abuse tactics. This isn't his first attempt to exploit older collectors, and it shouldn't be allowed to continue." The investigation's conclusion marked a turning point. Harrison Webb, facing potential legal consequences for his false reports, finally retreated. The motorcycle community, having watched the drama unfold, rallied behind Margaret and the museum project with renewed enthusiasm. Letters of support poured in from around the world. Motorcycle clubs offered to fundraise. Museums proposed artifact loans. Individual collectors impressed by Margaret's principled stand, donated memorabilia and documentation. One particularly meaningful letter came from Alice Patterson, Dr. Patterson's daughter. My father has been depressed since retiring. He felt useless, forgotten by the industry he devoted his life to. Your museum has given him purpose again. He talks about his docent plans constantly, researches stories about every motorcycle, and smiles more than he has in years. Thank you for reminding him that his knowledge still matters. One significant challenge remained: funding. The initial sales had covered basic infrastructure, but creating a professional museum required substantial investment. Display cases, interactive exhibits, insurance, staffing. The cost seemed insurmountable. The solution came from an unexpected source. Theodore Hartley, Ezekiel's younger brother, appeared at the door on a rain-soaked October evening. Margaret almost didn't recognize the family resemblance. Where Ezekiel had been lean and weathered in photos, Theodore was soft and prosperous looking, clearly a man who'd spent his life in boardrooms rather than barns. I've been watching this property for 40 years, he said, standing awkwardly in Margaret's restored living room. Ezekiel and I had a falling out in 1978, stupid family dispute about our father's estate. We never reconciled, and then, his voice broke. Then Annie died, and he shut everyone out completely. Margaret served tea while Duke assessed this unexpected visitor with careful attention. Theodore composed himself and continued, "The fight was about motorcycles of all things. Our father left us equal shares of his collection. 5 bikes, nothing special, but they meant everything to us as boys. I wanted to sell them to fund my college education. Ezekiel wanted to preserve them. We said things, terrible things that brothers should never say." He paused, studying his hands. "I sold my share anyway, used the money to get my MBA, built a successful investment firm, made millions. But I lost my brother, and no amount of money could buy that back. I tried to reach out over the years, but Ezekiel returned every letter unopened. I knew about the motorcycle collection. We'd shared that passion as boys. I even tried to buy the property after he died, thinking I could preserve what he'd built. But by then, the bank had already accepted your offer. I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said gently. It's clear from his journals that motorcycles were Ezekiel's way of processing grief. Theodore nodded. He was always like that, internal, expressing himself through action rather than words. "Mrs. Wilson, I want to help. I've done well in business, and I have no children to inherit. Let me fund the museum properly as a memorial to both Ezekiel and Annie." The offer stunned Margaret. "That's extraordinarily generous, but—" "Please," Theodore interrupted. "I failed my brother in life. Let me honor him in death. I'm not talking about taking over. This is your vision, your project. I just want to provide the resources to do it right." Theodore shared his own memories of Ezekiel as they talked. How they'd rebuilt their first motorcycle together, a rusted Honda 50 their father had deemed hopeless. How Ezekiel had always been the mechanical genius while Theodore handled the business side of their teenage repair service. How pride and misunderstanding had destroyed a relationship that had once been unbreakable. "When we were boys, we'd spend entire summers in our father's garage," Theodore recalled. Ezekiel could diagnose engine problems by sound. I remember him teaching me to listen, really listen, to the machines. "They'll tell you what's wrong," he'd say, "if you pay attention." He pulled out a worn photograph, 2 young boys standing proudly beside a restored mini-bike. "Our first complete restoration. Took us 6 months. Ezekiel insisted on doing everything properly, even though we were only 12 and 14. That attention to detail never left him. He taught me everything I know about seeing potential where others see junk," Theodore continued. "I used that vision in business, made my fortune buying distressed companies and rebuilding them. But I lost sight of what really mattered. Family, connection, shared passion. Don't let me die with that regret." After much discussion, they reached an agreement. Theodore would establish an endowment for the museum, ensuring its long-term sustainability. In return, the museum would be named the Hartley Museum of Motorcycle Heritage, honoring both brothers and Annie's memory. "I have one other request," Theodore added. "I'd like to display our father's motorcycles, the ones that started our fight. I've spent 40 years tracking them down, buying them back one by one. They're restored now, like Ezekiel would have wanted. Maybe displaying them together can symbolize the reconciliation we never achieved in life. With proper funding secured, the project accelerated. Professional museum designers were consulted, climate control systems were upgraded, interactive displays were created, allowing visitors to hear engine sounds, see vintage racing footage, and explore mechanical diagrams. Dr. Patterson's archives were professionally preserved and integrated into exhibits. The designers, a team from Chicago, initially proposed a sleek, modern aesthetic, but Margaret insisted on maintaining the barn's agricultural character. People need to feel the history, she explained. Ezekiel preserved these motorcycles in this barn for a reason. We're not creating a sterile showcase. We're revealing treasures where they were hidden. The compromise was brilliant. Modern climate control and lighting hidden within the barn's original structure, interactive technology that complemented rather than dominated the displays, and viewing platforms that preserved the feeling of discovery Margaret had experienced that first day. Tom and his son Mike Brennan became official restoration consultants, working with Margaret to complete Ezekiel's unfinished projects. The 1938 Crocker, his final restoration, became a centerpiece exhibit showing the restoration process itself, before and after photos, tool displays, and video interviews with experts explaining the delicate work involved. The restoration process revealed more of Ezekiel's genius. His notebooks contained not just mechanical specifications, but philosophical musings on the nature of preservation. One entry particularly struck Margaret. Every restorer faces the ship of Theseus' paradox. If you replace every worn part, is it still the original motorcycle? I believe the answer lies not in the parts, but in the continuity of purpose. As long as the machine continues to embody its designer's vision and its rider's dreams, it remains authentic. We are curators of dreams made manifest in metal. Mike Brennan, working on completing the Crocker restoration, discovered something remarkable. Hidden inside the fuel tank was a small metal box containing a photograph of Ezekiel and Annie on their wedding day, along with a gold ring, Annie's wedding band. He must have placed it there after she died, Tom said quietly, making sure she'd always be part of his last project. They carefully preserved the items, eventually displaying them alongside the completed Crocker with a placard explaining their significance. It became one of the museum's most moving exhibits, illustrating how personal loss and mechanical preservation had intertwined in Ezekiel's life. The museum's educational mission took shape under Emma's guidance. They developed programs for local schools, teaching basic mechanics and the history of transportation. Scholarship funds were established for students pursuing technical education. The workshop hosted monthly restoration clinics where enthusiasts could learn traditional techniques. Sarah Morrison's curriculum proved especially popular. Her History Through Horsepower program drew students who'd never shown interest in traditional history classes. They learned about women's suffrage through the stories of early female riders, understood Industrial Revolution through engine development, explored immigration patterns through motorcycle ownership records. When a 16-year-old can trace how motorcycle design influenced youth, culture in the 1,960 seconds, they're learning history, sociology, economics, and technical literacy all at once, Sarah explained to the school board. This isn't dumbing down education, it's making it relevant. Dorothy May organized a women's motorcycle history exhibit highlighting forgotten pioneers like Bessie Stringfield, who rode solo across the United States in the 1,930 seconds and 40 seconds when few women even drove cars. The exhibit challenged stereotypes and inspired a new generation of female riders. She contributed something unexpected, a collection of photographs from the Millbrook Valkyries, her old riding club. The images showed women of all ages and backgrounds, united by their love of motorcycles and their refusal to be confined by social expectations. She also revealed a secret. I have Annie Hartley's riding jacket. She gave it to me just before she died, said she wanted it to inspire another generation of women riders. I've kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment. This museum is that moment. The jacket, displayed in a place of honor, became a pilgrimage site for female riders. Its worn leather and careful patches told stories of thousands of miles traveled, barriers broken, and freedom claimed. The restoration workshop became particularly popular with veterans. Dr. Patterson had suggested creating a program specifically for those dealing with PTSD or physical disabilities, working with their hands, focusing on mechanical problems with solvable solutions, provided therapeutic benefits that traditional counseling sometimes couldn't achieve. Marine veteran Carlos Rodriguez became a regular, initially drawn by curiosity but staying for the peace he found in restoration work. In combat, everything is chaos, he explained. Here, if something's broken, I can fix it. If a part doesn't fit, I can make it fit. There's control, logic, completion. It's healing. Margaret ensured the workshop remained accessible to all, regardless of ability to pay. Donations from wealthier museum patrons subsidized those who couldn't afford materials. Soon, restored motorcycles were rolling out regularly, with proceeds supporting the museum and expanding the program. As opening day approached in spring, Margaret often found herself walking through the transformed barn at night, Duke padding beside her. The motorcycles gleamed under professional lighting, each positioned to show its best angles while remaining accessible for close study. Information plaques told not just technical specifications, but human stories. The racers who rode them, the engineers who designed them, the collectors who preserved them. The plaques were Emma's innovation, written in accessible language that drew connections to contemporary life. The Vincent Black Shadow's description noted it was the Tesla of its time, revolutionary technology that redefined what was possible. The women's riding exhibit connected early female motorcyclists to modern movements for equality. In Ezekiel's workshop, now a featured exhibit itself, his last journal entry was displayed. Motorcycles are time machines. Not because they're old, but because they carry the dreams of everyone who ever threw a leg over them and felt the world blur past. Every scratch tells a story. Every modification speaks of someone trying to go faster, farther, or just differently than before. I saved these machines because they saved me, gave me purpose when Annie died, gave me something to protect and preserve. May they continue saving souls long after mine has moved on. Theodore added his own contribution to this display, a letter he'd written to Ezekiel but never sent, apologizing for their fight. Expressing his love and regret, visitors often stood for long minutes reading both documents, understanding how pride and pain could divide families, and how shared passion might heal those divisions even after death. The grand opening exceeded all expectations. Motorcycle enthusiasts arrived from across the country, drawn by word of mouth and social media buzz. The governor attended, praising the museum as an example of rural cultural development. Journalists documented the story of a widow who'd turned potential homelessness into a thriving cultural institution. The ribbon-cutting ceremony included a surprise. Theodore had arranged for a color guard of military veterans on motorcycles, honoring both Ezekiel's service and the machine's role in military history. As they roared up in formation, many attendees found themselves wiping away tears. Theodore Hartley cut the ribbon, his voice breaking as he spoke. My brother Ezekiel and his wife Annie dreamed of sharing their passion with the world. They believed motorcycles were more than machines. They were freedom, creativity, and human ingenuity made tangible. Today, thanks to Margaret Wilson's vision and this community's support, their dream lives on. He paused, composing himself. Ezekiel and I let pride divide us. I pray this museum will help others remember that what unites us, our passions, our dreams, our humanity, is stronger than what divides us. But the moment that mattered most to Margaret was when Theodore stood before the completed Crocker, tears streaming down his face. He would have been so proud, Theodore whispered, not just of the motorcycles, but of what you've built here. You've given his life's work, meaning he never could. A small hand tugged at Margaret's sleeve. A boy of perhaps 7 stood there, eyes wide with wonder. Ma'am, can I touch one? My grandpa says I shouldn't touch things in museums, but these are so beautiful. Margaret knelt to his level. What's your name? Tommy Chin. Margaret smiled, recognizing the name. This was Walter Chin's grandson. Well, Tommy, these motorcycles were made to be appreciated. Come with me. She led him to a 1,950 seconds Cushman Eagle, a small scooter perfect for young eyes to examine closely. This one carried newspapers, delivered groceries, gave teenagers their first taste of freedom. Go ahead, touch it gently. Feel the history. As Tommy reverently placed his small hand on the red tank, his grandfather Walter appeared, camera ready. The photo he took, a young boy connecting with mechanical history, would later become the museum's signature image, used in brochures and websites to show how the past could inspire future generations. In the months that followed, the museum became a destination. Weekend riders planned routes to include Millbrook. Families discovered that mechanical history could be as engaging as any theme park. Researchers arrived to study the archives. The museum's YouTube channel, managed by Emma, gained hundreds of thousands of subscribers, fascinated by restoration videos and historical deep dives. One particularly popular series featured Dr. Patterson explaining the engineering behind various motorcycles. His grandfatherly demeanor and deep knowledge made complex concepts accessible. Comments poured in from young people inspired to pursue engineering careers, older folks remembering their own riding days, and everyone between simply fascinated by the stories. The Harley-Davidson Knucklehead got its name from the rocker boxes that look like knuckles on a fist, he'd explain, camera zooming in on the distinctive shapes. But what's really remarkable is how this engine design solved the oil leak problems that plagued earlier models. Margaret established a tradition of monthly community days when locals could visit free. She wanted the museum to belong to Millbrook as much as to the wider world. Children who'd never shown interest in history became fascinated by the engineering challenges early motorcycle designers faced. Teenagers who might have left Millbrook for lack of opportunities found careers in restoration and museum management. One of those teenagers was Marcus Thompson, the 16-year-old from Maria Santos' youth program. After his transformative experience with the Honda CB 350, he became a museum regular, eventually becoming Jake Henderson's apprentice. Everyone always told me I was only good for trouble, Marcus told a group of visiting students. But here, when I rebuilt my first carburetor and the engine fired up, I realized I could create, not just destroy. These machines don't care about your past, only about whether you respect them enough to do the work right. Marcus's story exemplified what Margaret had come to understand about the collection. The motorcycles weren't just mechanical artifacts. They were vessels for memory, connection, and identity. Every visitor brought their own associations, their own stories, creating layers of meaning beyond what Ezekiel could have imagined. One particularly touching story came from Maria Santos, the social worker who brought at-risk youth to the museum for mechanical education programs. These kids have been told they're only good for trouble, she explained. But when they successfully rebuild a carburetor or get an old engine running, you can see their whole self-image change. They realize they're capable of creating, not just destroying. As the museum's first anniversary approached, Margaret received a letter that closed an important circle. The anonymous buyer of the Vincent Black Lightning, sold in desperation during the early renovation, requested a meeting. Margaret had always wondered about the buyer who'd paid so generously while insisting the bike remain available for display. Marcus Chen, the Seattle tech billionaire Tom had mentioned, arrived without fanfare. He was younger than Margaret expected, casual in jeans and a vintage motorcycle jacket, eyes bright with genuine enthusiasm rather than collector's greed. "Mrs. Wilson, I owe you an explanation," he said over coffee in her kitchen. "Tom Brennan told me about your situation last year, the discovery, the financial pressure, your determination to create a museum. I wanted to help but knew you'd refuse charity, so I bought the Vincent." Margaret studied this unexpected benefactor. Why that particular bike? "My grandfather rode a Vincent in China before the revolution. He told me stories about freedom, about the future, about how a machine could carry dreams as well as people. When he immigrated here with nothing, those stories were all he could give me. I've been looking for a Vincent like his for 20 years. He paused, emotion crossing his face. "When I was young, I thought his stories were just nostalgia. Now I understand they were about hope, about believing in possibilities even when you've lost everything. Your museum tells those same stories. And you're willing to loan it back for display?" Marcus smiled. "I'm willing to donate it back, permanently, on one condition, that you let me fund an expansion. An annex focusing on motorcycles' global cultural impact." My grandfather's story, and thousands like it, deserve to be told alongside the mechanical history. Margaret felt tears threaten. The generosity of strangers continued to amaze her. Miss Chen, I don't know what to say. Say yes. Let's build something even Ezekiel couldn't have imagined. The Chen Cultural Annex opened a year later, featuring motorcycles from around the world and their stories of cultural transformation. Marcus personally curated the Chinese section, including his grandfather's story and others who'd found freedom and identity through two wheels. The opening featured a special guest, Marcus's grandmother, 93-year-old Lin Chen, who'd ridden behind her husband on their Vincent through the chaos of 1,940 seconds China. Speaking through a translator, she told the crowd, "The motorcycle meant we could escape when danger came, find work where it existed, stay together when the world tried to tear us apart. It wasn't just a machine, it was our freedom made real." The museum's influence continued expanding beyond anything Margaret had imagined. Universities sent engineering students to study historical problem solving. Artists found inspiration in mechanical forms. Writers researched stories of early riders. The museum's scholarship program supported over 200 students in technical education, many of whom returned to volunteer or work at the museum. 5 years after that desperate day when foreclosure loomed, Margaret stood before a gathering of museum supporters to announce a major achievement. The Hartley Museum had been accepted into the Smithsonian Affiliations Program, recognizing its national significance in preserving transportation heritage. "When I bought this property," she told the audience, "I was simply trying to survive. I had no idea that Rusty Barn held not just motorcycles, but possibility. Ezekiel Hartley saved these machines from destruction. You've helped save them from obscurity. Together, we've built something that will educate and inspire long after we're gone." 20 years later, the museum continues to thrive. Emma's daughter, Margaret's granddaughter named Annie, in honor of the museum's spiritual founder, serves as director. The collection has grown through careful donations, but the core of Ezekiel's motorcycles remains exactly as he preserved them. On quiet evenings, if you walk through the museum after closing, you might find an elderly woman sitting in Ezekiel's workshop, a German Shepherd at her feet. Margaret, now in her 90s, still visits regularly, though she's long since passed daily operations to younger hands. "I thought my life was over when Robert died," she tells visitors who recognize her. But sometimes endings are just beginnings in disguise. Ezekiel saved these motorcycles from destruction. They saved me from despair. Now they save others. Veterans finding peace, students discovering careers, communities finding identity. The circle of rescue continues. And in the barn that once hid its treasures under dusty tarps, the motorcycles stand proudly in climate-controlled perfection, each one a testament to human ingenuity, perseverance, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not by seeking them, but by recognizing them when desperate circumstances place them in our path. The Hartley Museum of Motorcycle Heritage stands as proof that it's never too late to transform loss into purpose, never too late to build community from isolation, and never too late to discover that what looks like rust and ruin might actually be the foundation for everything that matters most.